From the snow-capped peaks of Tibet to the vast deserts of Xinjiang, from the dazzling cityscapes of Hong Kong to the turbulent waters of the South China Sea, a quiet redefinition of territory is unfolding, not through warfare, but through narratives. Yes, a story rewritten and repeated until all other memories are erased. China, as it tells its own story, is an ancient civilization, once divided, now rising to reclaim what is rightfully its own. But what's the reality? What happened after the Qing dynasty collapsed? Why have vast regions like Xinjiang, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia become inseparable parts of China? And are we witnessing a unification or a cultural erasure? In today's program, we'll uncover how China is redrawing its map, not just with force, but by reshaping collective memory. James Carter invites you to watch this report closely as we unravel the truth. Every nation has an origin story, a legend, a revolution, or a fated treaty in the history books. But these stories aren't just for remembering, they're for believing, and belief is the foundation of power. China understands this better than most. In classrooms, young generations are taught about a nation humiliated by foreign powers, torn by war and chaos, until the Communist Party rose to unify and revive it. That's the official version. But look at Tibet, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong, places where memories are distorted, voices silenced, temples razed, cultures assimilated, and protests branded as crimes. Ask the Chinese why their territory is so vast, and the answer is simple. It's always been this way. A seemingly straightforward statement, but it conceals a grand strategy of programming national memory and exporting it to the world. Spanning 9.6 million square kilometers, China is the world's third largest nation. But its borders weren't always so expansive. They're the result of centuries of expansion, control, and rewritten history. Now, Beijing is working to make the world believe in the version of history it has crafted. Decades ago, a historical map would show China as a narrower land centered around the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, the heartland of the Han Chinese. Beyond this core were independent kingdoms and civilizations, from Tibet to Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia to Southeast Asia, with distinct cultures, governments, and identities, unbound by any ancient definition of China. So, what changed? How did a nation born from fractured dynasties become the world's third largest empire? The truth is, China wasn't born a superpower. For much of its history, it was a patchwork of small states, constantly at war, perpetually divided. Only in rare periods, like the Qin, Han, or Tang dynasties, did it briefly achieve unity and expansion. Even then, regions like Korea, Vietnam, and Central Asia were under temporary influence, never permanent parts of the empire. Yet, the idea of expansion never faded. It wasn't a historical accident, but a long-term strategy, a persistent imperial dream. Chairman Mao Zedong, founder of the Communist Party, rejected the notion of a small, divided, or weak China. He crafted a new history, a new map, and a narrative repeated until questioning it became unthinkable. Today, President Xi Jinping steps onto the global stage not just as a leader, but as a second Mao, inheriting and amplifying this ambition. After the Tang dynasty, China fragmented again. The Song dynasty, though culturally vibrant, was territorially weak, unable to control the north, let alone Tibet or Xinjiang. True expansion came under the Qing dynasty, the final imperial era, led not by Han Chinese, but by the Manchus. The Qing established China's maximum extent, from the Sea of Japan to the Pamir Mountains, annexing Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and regions now part of Outer Mongolia and Central Asia. When the Qing collapsed in 1912, this map became the template for new ambitions. Xi Jinping has revived this vision, seemingly intent on expanding it further. Xinjiang and Tibet are tightly controlled, Inner Mongolia assimilated, Hong Kong's autonomy eroded, and the South China Sea redrawn with the infamous 9-Line. Once a region is woven into China's historical narrative, it becomes a target for absolute control. In Beijing's mind, the dream of unification won't be complete until all resistance, domestic and international, is crushed. The Qing collapse didn't birth a unified nation, but a fractured empire, splintered into countless pieces. The Republic of China claimed to be the successor state, but it was a name without power, as warlords ruled their domains like kings, with private armies and laws. Border regions like Tibet and Outer Mongolia broke away, forming governments, armies, and even diplomatic ties with other nations. On paper, China claimed the Qing's vast borders, but in reality, much of that territory was lost. From 1910 to 1940, China descended into chaos. Warlords clashed, Japan invaded, the nationalists rose and weakened, and the communists quietly expanded in rural areas. By 1949, the game changed. The Communist Party triumphed, and Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen Square. The nationalists fled to Taiwan, and Beijing began piecing together the Qing's lost territories under one flag and one vision. Not all regions were easily reclaimed. Xinjiang was under Soviet influence. Tibet operated as an independent state under the Dalai Lama. Inner Mongolia was ruled by local lords, and even Hainan, in the Han heartland, remained under nationalist control. The modern China we know was not rebuilt through peace, but through power, tightening its grip on each region until the Qing map became a 21st century reality. Mao understood that unifying a map wasn't enough. Reality had to be unified too. The campaign began in the farthest reaches, starting with Xinjiang, a rugged 1.6 million square kilometer region bordering Central Asia. In late 1949, rather than waging war, Beijing used soft tactics, negotiating with local lords and ethnic leaders. Some surrendered, but a dark event cast a shadow. Several Uyghur and Kazakh leaders died in a mysterious plane crash en route to meet Mao, a question mark that lingers today. The People's Liberation Army entered with little resistance, securing Xinjiang in months, a massive territorial, resource, and strategic victory. Next was Tibet, a vast highland plateau, independent since 1912. In October 1950, Chinese forces crossed the eastern border, overwhelming Tibet's small, outdated defenses. Within a year, the 17-point agreement was signed under duress, with Tibet nominally accepting Chinese sovereignty in exchange for promises of autonomy and religious freedom. Beijing called it peaceful liberation. Tibetans saw it as invasion and occupation, ending centuries of cultural and religious self-rule. Initially, Beijing kept the Dalai Lama in place, but this was temporary. Once control was solidified, real power tightened. North of the Great Wall, Inner Mongolia was a cultural crossroads, sometimes Chinese, sometimes a battleground for nomadic tribes. Under the Qing, both Inner and Outer Mongolia were part of the empire. But after its fall, they diverged. Outer Mongolia became a Soviet-aligned state, while Inner Mongolia, swayed by leftist leaders, aligned with China. In 1947, the Communist Party established the Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region, not as a gesture of tolerance, but as a political strategy to control from within. By 1949, Inner Mongolia was fully under Beijing's grip. Its borders expanded to encompass most traditional Mongolian lands in China. In just a few years, the communist government secured millions of square kilometers. Tibet, 1.2 million, Xinjiang, 1.6 million, and Inner Mongolia, 1.1 million, nearly half of modern China's landmass. These regions, with distinct histories, identities, and governments, were not part of the Han heartland until the mid-20th century. Beijing completed the puzzle by seizing Hainan in 1950 and coastal islands soon after, transforming a chaotic patchwork into a territorial superpower through control, not ideology. Today, China spans nearly 10 million square kilometers, but nearly half of this land, Regions like Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, Ningxia, and Guangxi, labeled autonomous, is not historically Han. These autonomous regions cover about 45% of China's territory, explaining its vast size. Conquering is one thing, keeping is another. These areas are distant not just geographically, but culturally, linguistically, and historically. Uyghurs have Islam and Turkic languages, Tibetans have Tibetan Buddhism, Mongolians have nomadic traditions, distinct national identities, not mere variations of Chinese. Here begins a deliberate assimilation campaign. On the surface, Beijing celebrates a family of 56 ethnic groups, but the goal is to erase differences and forge a singular Chinese identity. Cultures are marginalized, local languages replaced by Mandarin, religions monitored or suppressed. The most powerful tool? Population transfer. In Xinjiang, Han Chinese made up just 6% of the population in 1949. Decades of organized migration, workers, soldiers, engineers, and the paramilitary Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps pushed that figure to nearly 50%. In Inner Mongolia, Mongolians now account for just 17% of the population, with economic, political, and administrative power in Han hands. This isn't autonomy, it's demographic restructuring to ensure China never fractures again. The concept of autonomous regions sounds noble: cultural freedom, local governance, preserved identities. But peel back the veneer, and a meticulous assimilation campaign emerges, infiltrating every aspect of life. In Tibet, rugged terrain and past migration limits kept Tibetans at about 90% of the autonomous region's population. But in historic Tibetan areas like Qinghai and Sichuan, Han and Hui Chinese presence grows. Since the 2006 Qinghai-Tibet Railway opened, modern Chinese influence has flooded in with people, goods, and propaganda. Language is the first battleground. Mandarin is mandatory in schools, nominally bilingual, but effectively sidelining Tibetan, Uyghur, and Mongolian. In Inner Mongolia, 2020, protests erupted when Mongolian was removed from core curricula, a quiet erasure unfolding in Xinjiang and Tibet, too. Textbooks teach a great motherland, liberated from feudalism, omitting periods of independence, the Dalai Lama's leadership, or modern resistance. Even ethnic dances, costumes, and traditions are confined to state-sponsored festivals, props in a narrative of unity and diversity. Religion faces the tightest scrutiny. In Tibet, monasteries are routinely inspected, monks forced to study politics, and the next Dalai Lama must be state-approved. In Xinjiang, Islam is treated as a security threat. Children are barred from religious studies, and citizens are policed for their appearance, words, or private beliefs. Dissenters, even through poetry or folk songs, risk detention, forced labor, or disappearance. Since 2009, over 150 Tibetans have self-immolated in desperate protest. The 2000 Nissan Urumqi riots in Xinjiang left hundreds dead, triggering an unprecedented crackdown. This is control at any cost, executed not on battlefields, but behind high walls, under surveillance cameras, in so-called vocational training centers. Satellite imagery, leaked documents, and survivor testimonies expose a grim reality. Over 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims detained, stripped of their faith and language. Reports detail torture, forced sterilization, sexual abuse, and severed family ties. Children are sent to boarding schools not to learn, but to be reprogrammed into model Chinese citizens. Beijing sees success. No uprisings, no riots, only silence born of fear. A generation now speaks Mandarin, attends universities, and works nationwide, gradually forgetting who they are. This control is underpinned by an unprecedented surveillance state, facial recognition cameras, omnipresent police, and a single wrong word can make someone vanish overnight. Stability masks an unhealed wound, and Beijing knows its strongest weapon isn't the military, but the narrative. Change the story of the past, of identity, of freedom, and no bullets are needed to reshape a people. The South China Sea, a vital artery of global trade and a treasure trove of oil and gas, is Asia's greatest power chessboard. China plays openly, drawing a bizarre 9-dash line, claiming nearly the entire sea, slicing through the economic zones of Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. With no clear coordinates or legal basis, Beijing acts as if its claim is undeniable, signaling that controlling the South China Sea means dominating the Western Pacific. China doesn't wait for talks. It dredges sand, builds islands, and equips them with radar, missiles, and airstrips. Coral reefs like Fiery Cross and Mischief Reef, once barely visible at low tide, are now military outposts. In 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that China has no historical rights to the sea, but Beijing ignored it, pressing forward with armed coast guards and militia disguised as fishermen, harassing and intimidating to turn disputed waters into its backyard. This salami-slicing strategy, small, non-escalatory steps, advances without retreat. Unlike Tibet or Xinjiang, Hong Kong and Macau were reclaimed not by force, but by treaties. Hong Kong, a former British colony, returned to China in 1997. Macau, once Portuguese, in 1999. Beijing promised one country, two systems, preserving their legal, economic, and political freedoms. Initially, Hong Kong thrived, with strong rule of law and a free press. But when citizens demanded true democratic elections, Beijing responded with suppression, not debate. Massive protests erupted, marked by black flags, masks, tear gas, and cries for freedom. In 2020, a devastating blow landed, a national security law imposed directly by Beijing, bypassing Hong Kong's legislature. Media was muzzled, activists arrested, and free expression labeled as sedition. Today, Hong Kong's Victoria Harbour and skyline remain, but the spirit of freedom that defined it lies buried under Beijing's laws. No tanks were needed. Control came through decrees and silence. Taiwan, in Beijing's eyes, is an inseparable part of China, yet it has never been ruled by the Communist Party, not for a single day. After the nationalists fled to Taiwan in 1949, it became a de facto independent state, evolving into a vibrant democracy with a free press and a world-leading tech economy. For 70 years, Beijing has vowed to reclaim it, by diplomacy if possible, by force if necessary. Its argument is simple. Taiwan is an internal matter. But the reality is global. If China seizes Taiwan, Asia-Pacific security would collapse, global tech supply chains would shatter, and a chilling message would resonate. No one escapes Beijing's reach. Taiwanese resist not out of hatred for China, but from seeing Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet's fates. They fight not just military threats, but a world where freedom is traded for control. In China's ambitious map, Taiwan is the unfinished piece of the Chinese dream. Since 1949, Taiwan has operated independently, a democratic and technological powerhouse. Beijing calls it a rogue province, but most Taiwanese see themselves as a distinct nation. China's daily fighter jet incursions, mock invasion drills, diplomatic isolation, and economic pressure form a relentless campaign. The goal remains unchanged. Taiwan must return, willing or not. That concludes today's program. Share your thoughts below and subscribe to Worldview Today if this is your first time watching our content.